Kia ora koutou and hello to everyone. Welcome to this special video session we've made to celebrate International Angelman Day 2023. My name's Ursula Crystal and I'm the chairperson of the Angelman Network in New Zealand and mother of a handsome young man who has Angelman syndrome. I'm also the co-founder of International Angelman Day, which we celebrate each year on the 15th of February. The Angelman Network initially offered to manage the website and Facebook page, which I've been doing for the past 10 years. Though the Angelman Network is based in New Zealand, we've always intentionally been well connected to our global Angelman community, with a focus on sharing up-to-date information about Angelman syndrome and advocating for inclusion. Not only for people with Angelman syndrome and their families in New Zealand, but also inclusion in a wider social context. So it's in this spirit that we really want to celebrate the culture of inclusion, collaboration, and unity that has grown within our global Angelman collective over the past decade. In 2013, we had a total of 31 official national Angelman organizations around the world, and today we have a total of 55 organizations, all supporting this wonderful annual event. We all have the same goal, to give our loved ones who've got Angelman syndrome a better life. And time is not on our side. By working together, we are far more effective. Together, we have a louder voice within the rare disorder community, within the broader disability sector, and in the general public arena. Together, we can gather more data about Angelman syndrome, which is vital for policymakers as well as for research. Together, we can do our best to make sure that every person born with Angelman syndrome, now and in the future, anywhere in the world, will be able to access support and resources and enjoy their best quality of life. We're excited to share this video collaboration in recognition of the 10 years that our IAD Global Collective has been raising awareness for Angelman syndrome on the 15th of February. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Amanda Moore, CEO of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation in the USA, and Amelia Beatty, Secretary of FAST Parent Organization, and who currently lives in Jordan. They have both kindly offered to share their latest updates related to Angelman syndrome research and communication. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to learn more about Angelman syndrome. Thank you to those organizing events, and thank you to those participating in these events, picnics, and fundraisers this year. I hope you all have a fun International Angelman Day 2023. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ursula. We are so excited to be here, and happy International Angelman Day to this amazing community. My name is Amanda Moore, and not only am I the CEO of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, but I'm mom to Jackson, who is 7 with Angelman. We're so excited as the ASF to be here and support families, as that's been our goal for the past 30 years, to support families in their day-to-day living and their journey through different family support programs, through our clinic network here in the US and all across the world to give the best clinical care possible, and through our research to help try to find those treatments to help better the quality of life of our loved ones with Angelman syndrome. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Tabby Jones, who is going to be going over communication, all things communications. We know that this can be a struggle for our loved ones. And so we're really excited to do a short introduction to different AACs, different sign language, different ways that our kids can communicate through their journey. And also introduce you to our brand new website coming soon, Stepping Up with AAC. So thank you so much for having us. We hope this is helpful, and have an amazing International Angelman Day.
Hello, Angelman community. Again, my name is Amelia Beatty. I live in the Middle East, and my youngest son, Orion, is 7 years old and lives with Angelman syndrome. I'm a volunteer on the board of directors for FAST, the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. And one of the things I help with is to coordinate our incredible FAST global chapters. So a big hello to all of them today. I want to wish all Angelman families, physicians, researchers, industry partners, therapists, teachers, and friends all over the world a wonderful IAD from FAST. As you can see, I am ready. I'm wearing my IAD t-shirt from FAST Spain. We're excited to participate in this webinar today with Ursula from the Angelman Network and Amanda from the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. FAST's contribution to this amazing webinar is an exciting overview of the important research that FAST is funding as we strive to achieve our mission of bringing transformative therapeutics to all individuals living with Angelman syndrome around the world. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Alison Brent, FAST's Chief Science Officer, and Dr. Nicole Coping, FAST Science Director, who will be sharing with the Angelman community our roadmap to a cure.
We want to wish everyone a very happy International Angelman Day. Today, I'm so excited to be able to present with Nicole Coping, our new Science Director at the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. And we're going to share with you FAST Roadmap to a Cure in order to discuss how we're advancing translational research for Angelman syndrome. My name is Alison Brent. As most of you know, I am the Chief Science Officer at the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. I also serve as the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium Co-Director. And the most important job that I have is I'm the mother to this beautiful little girl on the right. Her name is Quincy. She is 8 years old and she lives with Angelman syndrome.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm FAST New Science Director, and I'm so excited to be a part of the team and moving things forward in the AS research field.
Great. So in full disclosure, I was the co-founder and former chief operating officer and now serve with the minority profits interest holder in Genetics Biotherapeutics. That company was recently acquired in July of 2022 by Ultragenyx Pharmaceutical. And I currently serve as the consultant for Ultragenyx. I'm also the chief development officer at a company advancing neurodevelopmental disorder gene and disease modifying therapies called Mazi Therapeutics. I'm a consultant and I advise drug development initiatives for numerous other rare disease organizations. And I'm a member of the N of 1 Collaborative.
And I do not have any disclosures.
Great. So today we're going to just summarize for you FAST's new Roadmap to a Cure, which we're calling Roadmap to a Cure 2.0, which has really been able to advance over the last 12 to 24 months in order to really see movement in the translational research space for Angelman syndrome. So let's just start with an introduction. What is Angelman syndrome? Because it's really important to understand the genetics behind Angelman syndrome to truly understand the roadmap and what our opportunities are for transformative treatments for the disorder. So if we all remember, humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. So 1 through 23, one copy comes from the mother and one copy comes from the father, with 23 pairs making 46 chromosomes. And Angelman syndrome is caused by a severe reduction in the expression of a single gene on this single chromosome. And this gene is called UBE3A, and it sits on chromosome 15. It affects approximately 1 in 15,000 individuals, which could translate to over 500,000 people worldwide. It is random and it is very rarely inherited, but it can be. Each chromosome is made up of various different genes, and those genes generally code for different proteins in our body that allow our body to function properly. And when there's any type of mutation or dysfunction to one of these proteins, you can get a disorder. And the disorder we're going to talk about today is Angelman syndrome. So just to break down the schematics of understanding the genetics behind Angelman, like I said earlier, on chromosome 15, we have one copy from the mom and one copy from the dad, called the maternal or the paternal. And what that looks like in a schematic is that these two copies are sitting right next to each other. And the UBE3A gene, which is the gene that is really implicated in the syndrome of Angelman syndrome, if that gene has a problem, we can see the symptoms that we all experience with our loved ones. What's really interesting about this gene is that in every neuron of the brain, so only in the cells of the brain, the father's copy is actually silenced or stopped by something called the UBE3A antisense transcript. And ultimately, the UBE3A antisense transcript is a long piece of RNA that basically inhibits or stops the UBE3A gene on the father's copy from being read. Therefore, you and I, and most people in the world, only have one copy in our neurons that are being read of UBE3A, and that comes from the maternal or the mother's copy. But unfortunately, in individuals living with Angelman syndrome, that copy is either deleted or mutated or silenced, and they don't have a functional maternal copy of the gene along with a silent paternal copy of the gene. Therefore, there are no reading copies of UBE3A in the brain, but the rest of the body that is not imprinted has one copy of the gene that is being read, and that is called paternally silenced or imprinted. So what does that mean for your loved one living with Angelman syndrome? There are many different genotypes, and what that basically means is that there are different ways that Angelman syndrome can occur. One is a deletion, and a deletion is where there's a chunk of DNA that's missing, and that happens in about 70 to 80%. Two is a mutation, where one little letter is actually misplaced with a different letter or the wrong letter, and that results in the protein not being appropriately read. And that's called a mutation. And that's about 10% of individuals. Then there's a condition where the silent father's copy is duplicated, and there is no mother's copy, and you have two silent father's copies, and that's called UPD, or uniparental disomy, which is about 3% of individuals. And then there's something called an imprinting center defect, which is where you have, similar to UPD, two silent copies, one paternal, but a silent maternal based off of the imprinting center that has been deleted or mutated. And ultimately, that region results in silencing of the mother's copy as well as the father's copy. And that happens in about 3% of individuals. And so really, when we think about Angelman syndrome, this is the majority of the way that it can occur. And there's a very, very small subset that also has a condition called mosaicism, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So why is UBE3A so important? Well, UBE3A is an enzyme that essentially is meant to tag other proteins and regulate the junction between neurons and how they communicate. And so by tagging other proteins and other enzymes in the brain, it can clean up proteins that are excessive, and it can actually upregulate proteins that need more. And typically, this is important for keeping it very clear and very coordinated in the brain. And that tagging is called ubiquitination, and that is necessary for neuronal communication. This is required for normal synaptic function, and it is ultimately with a deficiency in accumulation of necessary materials inside and around cells of the brain. If we have a deficiency or an accumulation, then it results in a disease between neurons called a synaptopathy. And that happens in the communication between two neurons. Accumulation of these signals and a failure of the communication to occur really results in something called a failure of tonic inhibition. And what does that mean? Well, basically what that means is if you have too many proteins that are active and not enough proteins that are passive or inhibiting in this area, then there's a lot of noise happening at this junction. And that noise really makes it difficult for the neuron to communicate to the next neuron, making it very, very hard for the neurons to function properly. And that really does lead to the symptoms of Angelman syndrome. So when we think about those symptoms, we probably are describing most of the loved ones that you're thinking of that you either live with or are encountering on a routine basis. And that is the clinical manifestations of Angelman syndrome. We know that they're severe, we know that they're lifelong, and we know that they very much impact patients and caregivers. These symptoms result in a universal lack of speech, life-threatening and debilitating seizures, severe developmental delay, incoordination and ataxia when walking, apraxia and dyspraxia when learning and executing, can have disruptive behaviors, significant sleep disturbances, GI issues, feeding issues, and ultimately these individuals are unable to live an independent life, and there's a huge clinical unmet need. The impact on the family is pretty profound as well. Some families can't maintain employment because somebody has to stay home and maintain, all of the needs of their loved one living with AS. Parents can have significant anxiety and depression or stress. They can lose sleep. They can feel socially isolated. It can have an impact on families and their relationships, and certainly can be very, very difficult to not only care for their loved one, but to care for each other, the other children in the home, as well as their spouse. And overall fatigue can be incredibly challenging due to the loss of sleep and the emotional exhaustion of living with individuals with such a significant disability. And so really the impact on the family cannot be taken lightly. And our goal here is to really talk about how we can change the impact not only on the patients, but also on their families. So one thing that's really important to talk about is a strong hypothesis of how improving or changing the expression of UBE3A can really impact potentially the lives of these individuals. So individuals with mosaicism, which is a genotype that I mentioned earlier, where some cells are expressing UBE3A and some cells are not expressing UBE3A, you have a really good sense of what it would look like if individuals were given back some UBE3A in a very, very small amount. And so this paper that was published in 2004 showed that individuals with no UBE3A versus individuals with up to 40% of UBE3A have really a clinical trajectory that's very, very different. So if you look at those that express 1 to 5% of maternal cells with UBE3A, they have few to no seizures, they're ambulatory, they have some ataxia, and they have some speech. If you look at those with 20% of UBE3A, they have no seizures, they're very ambulatory, they have minimal to no ataxia, and they can speak in sentences. And those above 40% are really not reported in the genetic databases because they are probably asymptomatic. So what does that mean? That means that a child living with 1 to 5% of UBE3A is a different child than the child that I live with every day. Quincy has 0% of UBE3A from the maternal copy, and she lives with seizures, she lives with significant ataxia, and she has absolutely no speech. And so if my daughter can be in this category of getting 1 to 5% of UBE3A, that would be life-changing for her. When I think about 10% or 20% or 30%, her clinical trajectory just goes up profoundly, which is why we have a lot of reason to believe that a little bit in Angelman syndrome can go a very, very long way. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, who's going to talk about FAST Roadmap to a Cure. Take it away, Nicole.
Thanks. So in an approach to treating Angelman syndrome, FAST organized this roadmap to a cure that includes 4 pillars. So pillar 1 is focusing on mom's gene, so fixing mom's gene. Pillar 2 is turning on or reactivating dad's gene. Pillar 3 is focusing on downstream targets outside of UBE3A, the gene specifically. And then pillar 4 is all the work accelerating and preparing for clinical trials. So what does this look like in the brain? So pillar 1 and pillar 2, so gene and protein replacement of mom and paternal gene activation in dad. And then pillar 3, you have downstream targets, but particularly at the synapse. And then you have pillar 4, which is all of the preparation work to accelerate. So are you creating animal models? Are you characterizing them? What are the biomarkers? What are these outcome measures? What are the assays that you're using to get everything from bench to bedside? And so we're going to start with pillar 1, fixing the mom's gene. And this is either through protein or gene replacement therapy. So one of the first challenges you face when introducing any sort of treatment into a human with a neurological disorder is the delivery problem. You can't just stick something in the brain because there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier that basically prevents any pathogens and stuff from getting into the brain. And so one of the ways of bypassing that is using viral vectors, and that's where the vector has basically been emptied of all of the bad components of the viral vector and is used to transport any sort of gene or protein therapy into the human body. So here for under pillar 1, where we're basically looking at either a gene or enzyme replacement, several research projects have been using AAV, which is a type of viral vector, in order to introduce a functioning UBE3A copy into animal models. And so that work has been done at USF and UPenn and UNC. And you see a lot of rescue in some motor and cognitive function in animal models. And then interestingly, a new project that we've been working on is a lentiviral vector packaged in these hematopoietic stem cells. And this is basically replacing the protein of UBE3A into an AS mouse model. And they saw phenotypic rescue across motor, behavior, and electrophysiological readouts. And this was a really interesting project because it actually was able to show rescue in both an adult and a neonate treated animal. So it's promised that there's a chance of not just a critical window, but you can actually treat at various different ages and see some sort of like phenotypic result. So to look at an example of what this looks like, we're going to focus on that gene replacement therapy where the hematopoietic stem cells carrying the functioning UBE3A protein was given as a therapeutic. So on the left, you can see a mouse on a Digigate treadmill. And so this is a running treadmill where basically underneath is a light and the animal moves at a consistent speed with the acceleration of the track. As you can see on the left, this is a mouse, this is an Angelman syndrome mouse model, and it's struggling to keep up. The pace is slow, the gait is wide, and the back of the animal keeps hitting the back of the bumper. It's unable to perform the task. In the same animal, after the therapy with the functional protein, you can see with the same task, the same treadmill, very, very easily being able to perform this task. They're keeping up, they're no longer hitting the back bumper. And so this is like a really strong, promising view of what can happen after just one treatment of this functional UBE3A. So next we're going to focus on pillar 2, which is reactivating DAD's copy. So again, as a reminder, in every human brain, you have your maternal copy and your paternal copy silenced, and everyone, you and me included. But in Angelman syndrome, you just have a loss of function of the maternal side. And so with that paternal copy there, but silenced, is there a way that we can basically turn on that paternal copy and somehow get UBE3 expression throughout the brain? And so there's been a lot of different approaches basically to reactivating the paternal allele. And so the paternal allele, as Allison had explained, is silenced by a long antisense transcript. And there are various different methods in which you can target that antisense transcript and basically stop it from binding to the paternal allele, thus allowing paternal expression throughout the brain. And so some of those approaches include antisense oligonucleotides, artificial transcription factors that are zinc-based. You have short hair RNAs, microRNAs, and CRISPR. And all of these are designed to somehow prohibit the antisense transcript from binding to the paternal allele and then allowing for paternal expression. And here we have an example of what that looks like in a model. So this is a rotorod, and basically it's an accelerating rod that moves at a certain RPM per minute. On the far left, you have a wild type animal. They're able to complete the task. They're able to move along the rod. They stay on. In the middle, unfortunately, you can see the AS animal model. They're unable to stay on this rod compared to the wild type control. And then on the far right, you have an AS animal after this gene editing CRISPR technique where the CRISPR was targeted towards that antisense transcript. And you can see based off of like comparison to wild type and untreated animal, that the animal is able to stay on the rotating rod just as well as a wild type. And so this test is this assay is a test for motor learning and motor behavior. And you're seeing a huge rescue just after this treatment of basically reactivating paternal allele, which gives us hope that having a paternal expression could also be a therapeutic avenue towards treating Angelman syndrome. And then finally, we're going to focus on downstream targets. And so pillar 1 and pillar 2 focused on UBE3A, either the maternal copy or the paternal copy. Downstream targets, so pillar 3 is going to focus on everything kind of outside of that. And so this is a lot of the, this is a lot of the drugs and therapeutics designed to help at the synapse. And so we have ketone supplements. There was a clinical trial that basically looked at exogenous ketone and ketone supplements and how it helped to increase cognitive function as well as decrease seizure severity. You have IGF-1 and 2, which help with a lot of cognitive and memory and behavior. You have brain-derived neurotrophic factor or BDNF analogs that are being studied right now to help with plasticity and learning and memory. And then you have alogabot, which is a GABA alpha 5 positive allosteric modulator, which helps with a lot of the genes downstream of UBE3 that are deleted in like the large deletion animals, including all of the GABA, large deletion people, including all of the GABA genes downstream. And then finally, I wanted to like take a minute to reflect and say, when a lot of these preclinical studies started, they looked at maybe like one specific type of therapeutic and kind of suggested that there was a critical window in which you could have some sort of functional outcome. So there was a small period of time, usually early in life, in which you could give a treatment and see some sort of rescue. But what we found over lots of years and lots of research is that's not really true. You can actually give any sort of therapeutic, either neonatally or at adults or at juvenile, and see a wide range of rescue in these animal models. And so why that's important is we have individuals in the AS community that have that are all different ages, and so it's really exciting and promising for us to see that yes, we can see rescue for different therapeutics given at different ages. And then I'm going to turn it over to Allison to focus on pillar 4.
Great. And in pillar 4, we're going to talk about accelerating and preparing for clinical trials and how exciting it is that we're finally at the point where that actually is incredibly important to the future of translational research for Angelman syndrome. And so we are supporting a large number of efforts in order to be clinical ready for these innovative therapeutics. As we mentioned earlier, we're developing multiple animal models of all genotypes of Angelman syndrome, including 2 rats, a pig, a large deletion mouse model, and a non-UBE3A deleted mouse model to show what the other genes outside of UBE3A are impacting. We have put together a team, an International Angelman Syndrome Research Council called InSync, that is bringing together experts in the world that work inside and outside of Angelman syndrome in order to be able to help guide and advance and do a gap analysis of all of the work being done in Angelman syndrome from proof of concept all the way through to drug approvals in order to ensure that we don't leave any stone unturned for advancing therapeutics to individuals with Angelman syndrome. We are working very closely through the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium with a team of industry partners as well as the Angelman Syndrome Foundation in order to advance the natural history study for Angelman syndrome, which is incredibly important to run clinical trials and all of the data that's being collected by our loved ones living with Angelman syndrome to understand how they generally perform in daily life as well as on some of these structured tests. And how we can then potentially compare that to changing over time once they receive a therapeutic. We have 485 patients enrolled in this natural history study, and there's additional studies being underway globally in sponsored by FAST UK, FAST Latin America, FAST Italy, FAST Spain, and now one in France is underway. We have a global Angelman syndrome registry where over 2,000 patients are enrolled in order to be able to understand their milestones, their seizure frequencies, their seizure medications, and all of the things that really come outside of a natural history study that are imported by parents of what is it like living the day-to-day with a child with Angelman syndrome. And this information is made easily available to all of the industry partners to truly get a good sense of the demographics. Where do patients live? Where do they, what age are they? What genotype are they? And what does the population look like in different parts of the world? And then how do they behave? Are they similar in their behavior based on genotype in different parts of the world? And so that information has been incredibly valuable to drug companies. In addition, we launched the FAST Global Search and Rescue Initiative to find every patient around the world living with Angelman syndrome. Remember that we have an incidence predicted to be about 1 in 15,000, which should translate to about 500,000 people in the world living with AS. And we have documented about 2,000 people in the Global Search and Rescue. And it's really important that anybody listening to this that has a loved one living with Angelman syndrome can really register and get their name on this list of search and rescue. It is de-identified. Nobody will know who you are and nobody will contact you, but at least we can give a checkbox to the age, the genotype, and the country in which your loved one lives so that we can ensure that everybody is counted around the world, and that will help to drive where clinical trials will occur and where hopefully drug approvals will be. We have been really pushing for newborn screening efforts so that we can identify patients the minute that they're born in order for us to be able to understand where they are. And then one day when we have approved drugs, we'll be able to hopefully be able to treat these patients the day that they're diagnosed. And so that we can ensure that no patient living with Angelman syndrome has to experience the developmental delays that those living with Angelman syndrome today are experiencing. That also will help to more perfect our incidence rates so we really understand the number of people in the world living with Angelman syndrome. We have created a global clinical trial center of excellence for training clinical trials and innovative therapies for Angelman syndrome, which we'll talk a little bit more about, called the Fast Rush Center for Translational Research, in order to train doctors around the world to deliver some of these very intricate, very complicated therapies, gene and cell therapies for Angelman syndrome and other neurodevelopmental disorders, because that's a huge gap right now in the entire field globally. And we are advancing the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium. FAST has invested over $4 million into the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium in order to advance different endpoints to show they're meaningful and effective in order to develop treatments that can be evaluated in clinical trials in the most robust and sensitive way. And so we've been doing that since 2016 in collaboration with all of our drug companies, as well as FAST Australia, FAST UK, and the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. And so when we think about drug development, it's important as we really lay out our roadmap to a cure that we understand what it takes to develop a drug and to get it approved for access to patients. So in drug discovery, approximately 15,000 drugs in the discovery period. Of those, about 5,000 might make it into IND enabling studies. What does that mean? That means that we get a human candidate that can be de-risked for toxicology. So we have a drug that looks very promising in an animal. We make a human candidate of that drug, one that can be delivered to humans, and then we have to test it in models in order to show its safety. And that is a very, very expensive process. And about 5,000 out of 15,000 drugs get to that point. Of those 5,000, only 10 ever make it into a clinical trial. And of those 10, only 1 ever gets approved. And so knowing that we need at least 1, if not many approvals, we want as many approvals as we can get to ensure that every patient of every age of every genotype is treated, we have to ensure that we hit every single shot on goal and we never put all our eggs in one basket, because one drug may not ever get approved. And so we need to really ensure that we are hitting hard on as many possibilities that are promising and safe as possible. And so 7 years ago, this is what the pipeline looked like. We had one AAV gene therapy that was in the drug discovery phase. We had an ASO, we had a zinc finger, and we had a couple of downstream targets, all of which was in this drug discovery and preclinical area. Nothing was getting into humans, which is this green area right here. But we were moving there. It was just that we had a lot of work to do to get there. This is where we were a year ago. So a year ago, we had 34 programs in the pipeline, 10 AAV gene therapies, 1 hematopoietic stem cell gene therapy, 5 ASOs or spherical nucleic acids, 1 artificial transcription factor, 7 CRISPR programs, 1 enzyme replacement therapy program, 4 shRNA or miRNA programs, and 5 downstream targets. So we had a lot of opportunity in this space. 34 different programs, 3 of which were in clinical trials. 1 was approaching a clinical trial. Then what we realized was that all of these programs, those that are really tagged here with these pins, 12 of them were funded almost fully or robustly by FAST. So we had really put a tremendous amount of work and effort into advancing these programs, and we were carrying them through as far as we could. And the reason that's really important is that something happened in May of 2022 where the stock market essentially tanked from a biotech perspective. So the priorities of a lot of these biotech companies had to change because the investment in these biotech companies was really dwindling. And this was obviously all over the news. And what resulted from that is, of those 34 programs, 11 programs were canceled. And that brought us down to 24 programs because another program came online. And so we went from 34 programs to 24 programs. But what's important to realize is that the 12 FAST-funded programs never waned at all. And 1 additional FAST-funded program was brought into the fold. So now we have 13 FAST-funded programs. We didn't drop a single program, but 11 other programs were dropped, all of which were funded through pharmaceutical companies. And that's not to say pharmaceutical companies have done anything wrong, but we have to understand that we are not going to be the priority for every pharmaceutical company at every turn. They have to make decisions, financial decisions, based off of leadership and priorities. And unless somebody in their world or their family is dramatically impacted with Angelman syndrome, we can't guarantee that Angelman syndrome is going to be a priority. But what we can guarantee is if FAST is funding and advancing these programs, that if we are carrying them as far as we can, we will not drop a promising program unless there is a reason to believe it is unsafe or not efficacious for our loved ones living with Angelman syndrome, which is why we are still pushing the mark on all of our funded programs if there is a possibility for success to reach human application and to be safe. And so that is the chutes and ladders of drug development. Sometimes drug programs fail because of the lack of science. Sometimes they fail because people can't afford to keep pushing them forward because priorities change. And sometimes rare diseases are not the most profitable in the pharmaceutical space. And that's just the reality of the financial times. And so in these tumultuous financial times, we have to take the matters into our own hands and ensure that we continue to fund the most promising work at every turn. And that changes every year with new technological advances. And so as we think about the drug development pipeline advancing over the past 7 years, what we also need to think about are all of the other downstream pillar 4 things that need to advance: animal models, regulatory and clinical advancement, and patient access. And 7 years ago, we were early in our animal model work. We were early in our natural history study. Our diagnostic efforts were pretty low. We had very little, if no, regulatory engagement. We had no policy plan. We had very little in the way of endpoints and biomarkers and outcome measures specifically developed for Angelman syndrome, and we had no newborn screening efforts underway. And here today, if you look at where all of those marks have moved, we have come such a long way, not only on the drug development pipeline, but now we have lots of models, lots of registries, incredible endpoints, regulatory engagement, an advocacy and policy plan through government, diagnostic efforts that are very well underway, as well as newborn screening efforts. And one of the biggest gaps that we noted this year was that we didn't have clinical trial centers that were ready to accept the large number of patients that were going to be enrolling in these clinical trials, because running a clinical trial is not like running a clinic. And ultimately, it requires a totally different set of expertise, of logistics, of policies, and of coordination that a lot of just general patient care clinics cannot accommodate in a rapid way. And so this was a gap that we really clearly identified. And we decided to really advance some fast clinical trial centers of excellence in order to deliver interventional and innovative therapies as quickly and as safely as possible by ensuring that we can train as many doctors around the world and improve the infrastructure of as many hospitals around the world as possible to be able to be centers of excellence. And so in December of 2022, FAST gave a gift to Rush Hospital in Chicago in order to advance this first clinical trial center of excellence, led by Dr. Elizabeth Berry-Kravis, in order to be able to train multiple different clinicians around the world. And this is called the FAST Center for Translational Research in the Pediatric Neuroscience at Rush University. And so our goal over the next 10 years is to have centers like this around the world. We're going to be identifying centers that have the capability, the capacity, and the desire to be a clinical trial center of excellence for rare neurodevelopmental disorders to deliver novel and complicated innovative therapies. This isn't necessarily for oral pills or more simplistic types of therapeutics, but some of the more challenging ones where needles may need to be delivered into the brain or into the spinal fluid, and really precise training, expertise, and the infrastructure needs to be laid out and established in order to do that in a really robust way. And so FAST has an urgent mission to bring transformative treatments to our global community. We started out doing that through discovery and all of our academic collaborations, then through preclinical testing and infrastructure so that we could test animal models and cell lines. Now we have a clinical trial infrastructure in order to advance clinical trials for humans living with Angelman syndrome, advancing endpoints and biomarkers that are appropriate and meaningful for patients living with Angelman syndrome, and connecting patients with industry partners as well as those around the world, understanding who they are, where they are, and how we and drug companies can find them to ensure that every patient that wants a treatment around the world will eventually get one. And so we are really moving every step of the way in this roadmap in order to advance every facet. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, with the 5th one being clinical trial centers. We went from mouse and discovery to now we need to create the infrastructure for human application, which is a place we never thought we would be so quickly. But the good news is that we are, and this is the most exciting time for being a human living with Angelman syndrome that I've ever seen. And I think that most clinicians would say has ever existed for neurodevelopmental disorders, and Angelman syndrome is certainly leading the way. And so when we think about the disease modifying strategies, there's a lot of people in this space with gene and protein replacement therapy, paternal gene activation, and downstream targeting. And as we advance and think about how we get a drug from proof of concept to approval, we have to understand that a single drug and the cost of that can range between $66 and $130 million. And that's per drug. And where FAST is really strong and where we're focused is in this space right here. We need to de-risk and make sure that no one drops our programs and get through that preclinical drug discovery, IND enabling studies and toxicology studies, and into phase 1/2 clinical trials. So we have human data to support that nobody should be shelving, canceling, or dropping these programs. And that is how we de-risk them so that they're taken forward for eventual drug approvals by some of the best drug companies in the world. So our roadmap to a cure 2.0, we expect to look like this over the next 5 years, with multiple approvals, numerous therapeutics in clinical trial, including many gene and disease modifying therapies, multiple centers around the world advancing and delivering gene therapies and novel innovative therapies for Angelman syndrome, ensuring we have great policy plans, newborn screening efforts that are being finalized, and that we are by far going to see absolute transformative treatments for individuals around the world that want to experience some of those therapeutic opportunities. And so this is the space that FAST is excelling at, and this is the space we will continue to push our roadmap in order to ensure that we are always the low-hanging fruit. So overall, numerous potential therapeutic platforms have been invested in Angelman syndrome, and FAST has been the leader in that investment. Angelman syndrome is unique with many promising clinical results to date, which is very, very exciting, and that has been shared at the FAST Science Summit. We're focused to identify any gaps and accelerate all potential strategies, including all shots on goal, no single strategy until we have many drug approvals to reach every age, every genotype, and every country that has a child or an adult living with Angelman syndrome. And it's time to create the infrastructure for human drug delivery, which is a place we did not think we would be so quickly. And we are very excited to say that we are supporting this effort hugely. So I think it's fair to say that there are many disorders that will not be cured or treated in our lifetime, but Angelman syndrome will certainly not be one of them. And we know that it is not only possible, but absolutely probable that we will see life-changing treatments for individuals living with Angelman syndrome in the very near term. Remember that knowledge is power. Join the mission to cure AS. We're working together for you to understand and advocate for bringing these treatments forward for all individuals around the world living with Angelman syndrome. So I want to thank you for all of your time. And remember, things are either possible or impossible, and there's no in between. And so far, it looks pretty darn possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tabby, for being with us today. And thank you so much for all that you've done for the Angelman community. For those of you who are tuning in now, we're just going to do a short interview with our amazing friend here, but you can go and see a lot of her videos and a lot more of communication videos on our website. We have our communication training series, which you can access. We also have many of our past conferences that have been done. So there are so many different videos for the different stages you're at in your communication journey that you can get on our website. But Tabby, just to kind of set the tone for everyone that's watching, you know, for anyone who's listening, what is your advice for someone who is just getting into their communication journey with their loved one with Angelman syndrome?
I think the one thing to really be cognizant of is that don't let anyone tell you that your child isn't ready for AAC or that AAC isn't appropriate for them. And I mean, in some way, you've probably heard this advice before, but to break it down a little bit, I think it's important to recognize that AAC is not just an expressive language tool. Kids learn language by being exposed to language. So if you have a child that has a profile where, you know, verbal speech is not going to be functional for them for their lifelong, you know, to meet their lifelong needs, we need to start as early as possible. Kids start learning language in the womb. You know, they hear it, they're exposed to it. And kids that develop speech don't start speaking right away. You know, it takes time. If you go into a pediatrician's office, their language development chart, you know, looks out 5 years. So we know that it takes time for kids to develop language. So you want to get started as early as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your loved one is going to start using AAC as soon as you provide it to them. But by putting AAC in place, you are able to show them how that language works, how that visual representation of language works, which is different than the words that come out of your mouth. So you want to get started as early as possible. So if you have a team that doesn't know this about AAC, it's really important that you sort of step in and say, actually, I know my child is ready because they are learning language just by listening to me, but this is the language that they need to learn. So I want to get started as early as possible to really kind of challenge those perceptions and those views. And showcase your understanding of the fact that language really does need support as early as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean the child will be using the tool, but it puts it in place so that you and their other communication partners can.
I think that is so important because I don't know how many phone calls, email messages that we get at the foundation where families say, like, I want to get my child started like now, but we're being told by our speech therapist or by the school that it's just way, way too early. Like, you don't need to be thinking about that now. So that's an important, tool to hear and to listen to, and to take in. I think the challenge is what do you do, if when you don't feel as confident with it, to really push that message. So I think, like you said, helping your team understand that they are understanding and they're listening to the language that's happening, and to apply that as soon as possible. I'm going to throw a question at you that I didn't prepare you for, but like what advice do you give to a parent who maybe has that team who is incredibly reluctant, and keeps telling you, no, it's too early, or no, it's too late. Like, as a parent, what advice would you give them with that?
I would say there's lots of resources out there. And I mean, if you can find a different team, then do. And that's not always an option.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that there are resources out there, like the communication training series is a really good roadmap for getting started. And then, like, there's another project in the works that we're going to talk about in a minute. That's a really good roadmap for getting started. But in general, like, the basics of AAC are, you don't have to get it perfect to get started.
Right.
Like, you can get started. You can print a core board off the internet.
Right.
And you can look at some videos about what it means to model core vocabulary. And, that's going to feel rudimentary. That's okay.
Yeah.
But it's a way to get started, to see what your child does. And then, can you take information to the team to collaborate with them? Or can you, pair some of that core language, because that's really our building blocks that lets us talk about the things that are important to us, with, some visuals related to favorites and things that kids are involved in and do in their family. And can you put those two together to get some even if they're not pointing to the pictures, but they're acknowledging it, or they're slowing down and attending to you for, even a half a second more than they would have without it. That's all evidence that there is benefit in using those tools. So I think I would probably say it may not feel comfortable, but just do it anyway.
Yeah. Well, I know we had that problem, and I was terrified because I was like, okay, so I'm going to have to be like the expert here in some ways. And we started really simple. Like, we just cut out like core pictures of things that, we started very small. So we had a picture of a drink. We had a picture of going outside. We had a picture of the word want, and we Velcroed them to the wall. And we tried to get Jackson used to like pointing or taking and saying, like, I want a drink, or I want, and it took forever, but I can tell you, the first time he brought me the want card, I looked at him, I said, oh, I know. I said, oh, Jackson, what do you want? Show me what you want. And then he went over and grabbed the outside card. So of course, I think at the time it was like pouring down rain, and I'm like, we're going outside because we have to answer that. Like, you've just finally told me something that you wanted. And that was just with like simple cards on the wall, right?
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I think for some kids, the thing we have to remember is where your child is on their journey is going to vary. So this isn't for everyone, but some kids, what they need first is to learn that symbols are related to the words that are spoken.
Yes.
You know, and so just putting them in front of them starts and using them in a functional way. And I will say it's important that we not put a lot of demands on kids when we're
Yep.
doing this. Like it's very sort of conversational, or you're just pointing, oh, it's time to go outside as you point to outside.
Yeah.
Or, oh, I'm hungry, I want a snack. So you kind of own it for yourself so they can see how it works.
I'm
I think
sure
that's an
people who
important
come
piece of
into
it.
our house and they watch us do that, they're probably like, what are you guys what are you, because we do, like, the whole family would do that. Like, oh, Jackson, what do you want? Or, but you're right. I think the one thing that we learned, it's all about repetition. And like, I think it took him months to do that. And, there's times in that journey where it's so frustrating of like, it's right here, just point it, grab it, right? But
Mm.
just one day he just kind of decided he was going to do it. And that it was such an exciting thing. So it takes a lot of patience, right? To
Yeah, it does.
get
It
through it.
does.
So
And I think I hear a lot of families say like, they can do it, they have done it, but it's not there all the time. There's other ways that they communicate too, through body language and facial expressions. And if that's
mhm.
effective, then there's not really a lot of reason to use the symbols.
Yep.
But the symbols will always allow them to say more. It will
Yeah.
always allow them to talk beyond the here and now.
Yeah.
The example I always use is it's related to my own kids, but like they came back from my mom's house and they said, Grams let us have ice cream for breakfast, which is kind of taboo. Like we don't eat
That's
ice cream
awesome.
for breakfast.
Right.
But
Oh,
a
typical
child,
grandparent.
a child that cannot say that
Yeah.
might come back from grandma's and be really excited. And the assumption would be that they're excited because they got to hang out at grandma's. And you'd have no way of knowing that they got to have ice cream for breakfast.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
important that we use the symbols when we do know what they're communicating so they can see how it works, so that they can then learn to use the symbols when we don't know what they're communicating.
100%. I think that's so important because a lot of people, like, I know I beat up on myself because we at home don't use our device as much as it is implemented at school and other places. And, a lot of reasons is we try to give ourselves grace at night. We're all very tired. He's
Absolutely.
tired from a long day. And honestly, we know what he wants. Like, we know him well enough where he'll grab our hand and pull us towards something, and so we have to give ourselves grace that we're not doing this every second of the day because, for me, what's important is that when he is not with me, that he has the skills to communicate his needs if he's
Hmm.
not feeling well.
Yes.
That's what's more important to me because at home it's a safe place and usually we can figure out what's going on or what he needs. But when we're not
Yeah.
around, I think that's the part where, in my opinion, for my family, AAC and the communication is incredibly important. So he can express, his needs and
Yes.
desires. So,
Yes.
um, okay, so this is something that I know a lot of people who are listening to want to hear your thoughts and advice on. But a lot of our individuals with Angelman syndrome are older, and AAC and this whole idea of different type of communications maybe wasn't around when they were younger, or
Mm.
it wasn't there wasn't a lot of resources, support, therapies around it. So what if you have an older individual, or maybe your child is 9, 10, 11, and you haven't even started this journey? Like, is it ever too late to start?
It's not too late because I think the thing about language and communication is that it's really universal. So
Mhm.
we all are language learners throughout our entire life. We all acquire vocabulary throughout our lifetime. We change our communication styles based on our partners and our experiences. Um, like we become better problem solvers by solving problems.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of language wrapped up in things like problem solving. So I think that if you really sort of take that very universal perspective of communication, then it's really easy to understand that it's not too late. Um, but it's also important to understand that communication is very intrinsically motivated. So kids or adults or whatever age a person's coming to their AAC journey in, they're going to use it to the extent that it is meaningful to them and
Mhm.
supports a purpose for them and engages them with others. So I think that sometimes the shift of our focus might change a little bit. I think older individuals are more socially driven. They have more of a peer group. So we need to really figure out how to leverage AAC to support them in those interactions. But language learning, I mean, it is a lifelong journey. And again, I think that having communication allows it improves quality of life because it allows us to talk a thing about, or it allows us to communicate about things beyond the here and now. It
Right.
allows us to be specific about, you know, our thoughts or our, you know, our things we're anticipating or, you know, are looking forward to or anxious about. It gives, you know, words and which allows us to understand it better.
Yeah.
And again, receptive understand AAC supports receptive as well as expressive language. So even if you are, you know, if you have an AAC tool and you're able to engage with an older individual with that tool as sort of a shared focus, you'll be able to get more out of them, or you'll be able to engage with them in a different way, I
Yeah.
will say,
Yeah.
because they have a way to explore language that they've never had before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it may not be that they're pointing to what they're thinking or saying. They might just be exploring, but then they're also reacting. And what is that reaction in telling you? You know, what information are you getting from that? Like, how is it shifting the interaction?
Yeah.
Communication is so tied to quality of life that I think we want to give every tool available to individuals, no matter their age, because there's always more to learn. There's always ways to improve an interaction. It also slows down the interaction. So it might be that that individual is better able to, you know, understand what you're telling them because you're engaging at a slower rate. So I think that there's
Yeah.
lots of benefits.
Yeah.
And if you've tried AAC in the past and it hasn't worked, like, okay, disregard that information and move forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's changed so much. I mean, we are
Yeah.
in such an amazing time in history in terms of the tools that we have available to us and how accessible they are. I mean, they're accessible on our phones and our iPads that we carry
Right.
around with us all the time.
Yeah.
And there's lots of features that allow us to customize vocabulary so that we can, you know, like that support the learning of how they're organized. So I absolutely, I mean, communication is a lifelong journey and we can all
Yeah.
jump in at any time. And it's learnable. I mean, like as communication partners that are supporting, you know, individuals with Angelman, we are learning the tools. So there's no reason they can't,
Right.
you know?
Well, and what's so interesting is, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where even as a parent, there's so many different options and so many different varieties of of what you can choose. I mean, one of the questions we get is like, which system are you guys using? Do you use LAMP? Do you use touch chat? I mean, there are such a variety,
There are a
which
lot.
can be incredibly intimidating and really scary, right? I mean, it's a lot to take in and it's a lot to process. And I think that, you know, COVID was really hard because a lot of our therapies ended up being virtual therapies and we all had to become PT, OT, speech therapist. And that's like, to me, it was like learning Latin, which I can't, like, my brain just can't process and comprehend, right? Like, of going through that. So I think that it's great that there's a lot of options, but just knowing that may have tried one in the past or the one that you're trying, you're just having no luck with, like maybe there's a different option, because we started off with LAMP because that's what our school district used. And it just didn't work for Jackson. And luckily we had a team that acknowledged that and said, you know, we've tried this for, you know, a good amount of time. Why don't we just try touch chat? Because that may be more simple for him. And then he picked it up really easily. So I think that's important too, of knowing that it's not a one size fits all, right, when it comes to this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a one size fits all. You know, and there's lots of factors to take into account, but in a lot of, even though LAMP may not have been a best fit in the long run, the fact that you were modeling language and sort of showing him, you know, how this can work, you know, like that even lays the foundation for moving, you know, even if you change your mind and move on to something different, you know, like it's not lost time.
Well, that's good because I think
Yeah.
once again, as a parent, we are incredibly hard on ourselves on a daily basis. I don't know how many times I go to bed at night and think about all the ways I failed Jackson, right? So I think it's important to know that if one process doesn't work, you're right. It's not like that time was wasted. Like you're still teaching some
Yeah.
core fundamentals that
Yeah.
will translate over. So keep
Yeah.
up,
I think
keep it
the other
up.
thing, yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind too, though, is that is knowing what progress can look like is
Mm,
very broad.
yeah,
So, you know, if your child is not touching the symbols, that is not the only indicator of progress. But if your child, you know, if you're modeling AAC when you're talking to your other child, just so that you're normalizing it and it's in the
yeah.
environment, and Jackson pauses, even though he's on the other side of the room, and his body stills, like that's indication that he's paying attention, that
That's
he's
so
listening,
interesting.
he's getting
Yeah.
some benefit from that. Or if you know, if a child has something to say and they're not yet using it, but they bring it to you, they're like, okay, I know this is supposed to help us understand each other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe you're only pointing to like one word and you're verbalizing the rest, but he has that understanding that this is in some way. So I think it's important too to have really open expectations about what
Yeah.
progress looks like, because it, again, those pediatrician language development charts cover 5 years, sometimes 7. So that
Yeah.
tells us about the time that it takes for language to develop. So that's, we have to allow that amount of time. You know,
Yeah.
if the child is learning AAC, they also need that time for language development.
I love that. I think that's a really good reminder and a really good thing to think about. I know that we often have Jackson's twin brother modeling for him. And I think sometimes Baden's the far better teacher than who is 7 years old than I am.
Siblings always are, siblings and
Yeah.
peers.
Totally. So, okay, so we only have a few more minutes together, and I want to spend some time getting people excited about this amazing program and resource that is going to be coming our way as a community
Mm,
soon. I am so thrilled, to partner and to be able, as from the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, support stepping into AAC because I think it's, we have the communication training series, but this is like the communication training like on speed. I like to say it's like
mm.
it's accessible, it's a kind of a roadmap to help you start. I'm not going to explain it though. Can you just tell me a little bit, like 30,000
Sure.
people, what stepping into AAC is?
Okay, sure. So stepping into AAC is a partnership project. So Amanda has been very gracious about supporting us and partnering with Practical AAC, which you probably are all very familiar with, and Carol Zangari. So stepping into AAC is a compilation of resources that will take you through 20 weeks of learning about AAC. It will include action steps. So every week you'll have 5 things to do with AAC, and they're all very doable. They're not going to take over your week. We have signposts. So this is really about the journey. You know, that's really
Mhm.
sort of thematically where we're headed with this. And the signposts are videos. And so every week there are 2 to 5 videos that sort of capture the theme of the week, or the sort of the crux of the content that's related to the week. So we're talking about um, you know, the big ideas around AAC, but also some of the more minutia of like, this is sort of your everyday interaction. You know, this is to facilitate meaningful interactions. And then we will have a travel log. So the last part is kind of, I guess it's like a newsletter style that really breaks down some key concepts around different aspects of AAC. I think what's really exciting about this project is that it's iterative. So concepts that are introduced, you know, in early weeks kind of spiral, and you hear about them again in the middle weeks, and then you see them applied in the later weeks. So it starts off, it's really some philosophical information to lay a foundation, but then by the time you get to the end, it's very practical. It's very embedded in your everyday. It is for anyone who is on their AAC journey and just feels like they need a refresh. So whether you're just getting started, whether you're at it and you feel like you're stagnating, or whether you have done it in the past but haven't really been there for a little while and you want to pick it back up, it is really geared towards families. So most of the examples are very much embedded in everyday interactions and activities and daily routines. But the content is very applicable to a wide range of communication partners who support AAC learners. So, our examples are really pulled from the Angelman community. I had the amazing opportunity to interview Angelman families, and it was like one of the best days of 2022.
It was well, and I mean, it was they echoed that as well. Being able to have those conversations and
Oh,
share their communication journey, I think, and I think it'll be really great because it will be so relatable to our community, right?
oh yeah. So I got to go through all of those interviews and take snippets and embed them in the videos. And it was like a month of just blip. It was just so joyful to listen
Oh,
to these
yay!
amazing families and just pull out their what they had to share. So I'm really
That's
excited
amazing.
about those about I think that might be my favorite part of the project was the family interviews.
Well, you're so good with
So
that, so
it was really fun. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's exciting. I
yeah.
think it's going to be an amazing asset to your community, obviously. However, the AAC community in general is really, really going to benefit
Oh, yeah.
because kids with Angelman syndrome, like they have such a there's so many components to the profile of a child
Yeah.
with Angelman syndrome. So I think that it really speaks to the needs of lots of different individual, disabilities that benefit from AAC. So I think there's really broad
Yeah.
application and benefits. So
Well, and we're excited
it's
about that too. I mean, obviously our focus is always the Angelman community, but I think as a community of communication learners, as a community of having an individual with some sort of different ability or diverse need, whatever it may be, it's important that we support as many people on this journey, because as a caregiver, I know how hard this process is, but how essential it is. So, if whatever we are able to support and create here in the Angelman community can support others, I think it'll be fantastic. So, along with that, I just want to make sure when we've announced this, a lot of the community has asked, like, where do I register? How much does it cost? Like, from what I understand, one, there won't be any cost, but two, this is a
no
web-based process. So you can
resource.
just get on
Yeah.
the website and
Yeah.
have access to it. Not only you, but if
Your team.
correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, like our school teams, our
Yeah.
communication teams, anyone can have access to this.
Yes. There will be a web address and you will go to it and everything will be laid out.
It's going to be
So
fantastic.
easy,
So,
easy
yeah.
peasy.
So coming soon. This has been a long project, and this team has worked really, really hard on
Yes.
this. So I'm excited. So for my last question for you before we have to let you go, like if you had to give one piece of advice to those in the Angelman community about communication in Angelman syndrome, what would it be?
Mm. I was feel like, what's my whim of the day?
Right, right.
No, okay. So actually this is pretty easy. I think that the one piece of advice I would give is that we are all really busy. And if you set yourself up to have to make time for AAC, you're probably not going to be very successful.
Mm,
So I would say thinking about a mindset shift from making time to do this thing that's a little bit foreign and maybe a little hard, also really important, and
mm,
ultimately it'll become kind of natural.
yeah.
Instead of thinking about making time for it, make space for it. And but what I mean by that is that if your dinner time routine if you're at the table for 15 or 20 minutes, make that 17 or 22 minutes. And in that routine, take 2 minutes to model AAC. Talk about your day. It doesn't have to be about the food. Talk about your day. If you're getting ready to walk out the door to be on your way to get to school and work or whatever with your child, and it takes you, you leave yourself 10 minutes to get shoes on and jacket on and that kind of thing, give yourself 12 minutes
Mm,
and tell your child what the day will bring
yeah.
and use
Yeah.
AAC. So if you can sliver in 2 minutes throughout the day, 3 times a day, 5 times a day, 10 times a day, you're normalizing AAC. You're showing your child that AAC is always available. You're giving them the opportunity to see how it can work in everyday life. And it's really, really hard to say, all right, we're going to spend a half an hour with your communication device, before dinner tonight. Like, don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, do it if you can.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
harm in it. But if you set yourself up with those kinds of expectations, it's really hard to sustain. But if you can
100%.
just like eke out a little bit of space in between the routines of your day, and that might be hard too. But if you can do that, it's much more sustainable and it's much more doable. And it sends this more overarching message about the importance of AAC and communication, and about how natural it is, and about how, it fits everywhere. Language is not the activity, it's part of all of our activities.
Yeah.
So I think that makes it much more doable for families. And if you go a whole day and you don't model, don't beat yourself up about, like, tomorrow's another day. Just pick it up and pick it up.
I think that's
So,
great advice, because I do think when you say, well, I have to do something with AAC today, so we'll just do it for 10-20 minutes, and then if you miss it, you feel like you've totally failed and missed that part. So I love the idea of just embedding it into as much as you can. And I think the last point is the best point in some ways, because once again, as parents to those living with Angelman syndrome, we beat ourselves up constantly about the things that we weren't able to do for our child that day. And so I think giving you, especially with this journey with communication, like, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's going to be something that is
absolutely.
going to be embedded for, for your journey, to give yourself as much grace to this process. Because the more I find, the more I beat myself up on it, the more I
Don't do it.
withdraw from it and don't do it, right? And so giving
Yeah.
yourself as much grace as possible. So
Yeah, grace is so important on this journey. I say
yeah.
that to families a lot. So I'm glad that you
Yeah, well,
to hear you say that too.
grace period in life is important. So we if we can practice it with our kids, we can practice it with so many other things. So,
Yeah, that's so
well,
true.
Tabby, thank you so
So
much.
true.
And for those of you that are watching, this is the end of our awesome International Angelman Day. I hope you guys have an amazing International Angelman Day, and come at it in a spirit of hope and excitement of what the community is doing, what is coming for our community. It's an exciting time. So I just love all of you so much, and thankful for all that you do for the community. So happy International Angelman Day. Thank you, Tabby, so much, and we'll see you guys soon.
My pleasure.